Evil West is what I can only describe as a throwback to the Xbox 360 and PS3 era of gaming. Now, that isn't necessarily in a negative sense. This time period produced a lot of games that were story focused and had tight gameplay, linear level designs, and a hook to kind of keep you interested in playing. There was a couple of games that came out such as Damnation, Dark Void, Spec Ops: The Line, John Woo's Stranglehold. There was a hell of a lot of games in that period, especially for the 360, that I did get a chance to play, and I do get this feeling from Evil West, even after my 14 hours or so with the game. I wanted to thank Sandbox Strat for sending us an early copy to check out and review the game. I've been excited for this game for a long while. I've covered it on the channel quite a lot, so let's get into all the details and tell you whether or not Evil West is a game you should be playing, or, like the westerns of old, should be left in the past. I often see a lot of games that are smaller in scale but have a unique offering or unique selling point, such as Evil West. But the important distinction to make is that there is things such as AA or lower budget titles in comparison to big budget AAA games. These games I always expect to have a little bit of a rough edge, have flaws, pain points, and things that kind of stick out in comparison to bigger budget games. Evil West falls into this category. It has a story that has a lot of B-movie dialogue, gameplay that gets progressively better as you go on. Graphically, I think it falls behind the current era, and also has some very basic design which wasn't too compelling to head through, especially when it was very linear. I don't want this review to be too negative or try and convince you to play. I'm just giving my honest thoughts, and hopefully it gives you the ability to make a decision on whether or not you want to pick the game up for yourself. A brief synopsis of Evil West's story goes something like this. The game is set in a western period where vampires, monsters, and demons are rampant, which is bad. We are monster slayer Jesse Rentier, who is on the hunt for said monsters, vampires, and demons, which is good. The vampires have found a way to spread disease to all of humanity and take over, which is bad. As Jesse, we need to fight our way through hordes of enemies in an ultimate attempt to stop vampires from winning, which is good. The story in Evil West is rather basic, and you can predict the ending from quite early on, just without the set pieces and locations that you get to see. But surprisingly, as negative as that sounds, there is a certain charm these games have over me. I just enjoy kind of like bad dialogue, but kind of like B-movie dialogue, and I don't know why I find it enjoyable. I think it's mainly down to the concept and the presentation of it. It feels very much like a straight-to streaming service like Netflix or Amazon B-movie, where the action, the plot is just told from someone who wants to make this type of game in this sense of a movie, wants to make this type of story. And this may be a turn-off for most people, but I rather enjoy the dialogue back and forth between the cast of characters. Jesse is trying to ultimately live up to his father's name at the head of the Rentier Institute as this like group of paranormal hunters, essentially. And, you know, he's going to be hot-headed, wants to get straight into the action. There's also a guy called Edgar, who's this grizzled veteran who tried to retire, but is brought back into the fold and offers a lot of banter with Jesse. And then there's a lot of other characters in the game, characters we haven't seen, one such as Amelia Blackwell, and she is essentially a doctor who has her odds with Jesse throughout the story when it comes to protocol of the Institute and how they should do things, and there's that conflict there. And then you have Harrow. Now, Harrow is a very dislikable guy. He's a government guy. His dialogue isn't particularly great in the way that he insults people, but I think he's that one that, like, you want to hate him in the story, ultimately because he gets his like comeuppance in the end. He gets what he deserves, which is why I think he's in this game, to be that kind of like secondary antagonist. There's an engineer character, and then there's a couple of other agents that you do run into, and just some side characters that you also run into. And yeah, it's something that you have kind of seen in this cast of characters before. What I will say is, though, the antagonist in this, her name is Felicity, and she is a vampire. They essentially want to take over the world, change the way that the vampires are working things, you know, typical vampy stuff. She is kind of creepy at times. The voice actor should definitely get into some horror movies as like a horror movie villain, because there was just something about her voice and the way that she gave her performance that, even though the dialogue wasn't too crazy, it was just kind of very skin crawly. I just didn't like the way that the voice was, and I suppose that's the effect that it's supposed to be. It was kind of like this like ring girl, like childlike voice, and it was just super creepy. So credit to the VO there, and I think all of the VOs gave good performances for the most part, and the story is primarily told via pre-made cutscenes to show you the story, and there's a few like in-game moments here and there that you may see. But as I say, the story is kind of middle of the road. It's got some good, some bad, but I feel like most people will lean on the bad side because they don't have a weird sense of humor like I do, which is fine. I just think there maybe could be a focus more on the monster hunting aspects, different types of monsters, hunts, that type of thing, and maybe just a different variety of enemies than just vampires and like this vampire storyline. And yeah, I think this is just what the main thing is, the main focus of Evil West in terms of its narrative. Evil West has a decent overall combat system, and the thought put into the progression of abilities in the game is generally pretty good. My first recommendation is, if you do plan on playing this game, stay away from the higher difficulties, because it's okay in the start, but there is a sharp increase in encounters at the end of the game, and they can be kind of ridiculous because you'll get like 1 or 2 shot by some of the enemies, and I had to drop down to like the middle difficulty or like the regular setting because it got rather aggravating. But as soon as I switched, the game felt a hell of a lot better as soon as I dropped the setting down. As for the core elements of combat, there is a melee gauntlet which allows you to do a lot of different attacks. It also allows you to chain lightning and grab and pull enemies. There's the shooting element, hip fire, and also aiming. There's an energy like super ability which allows you to do some special attacks. And then there's some cooldown resources such as a flamer, explosives, and this big stun mechanic thing that you can do, which is pretty cool. What I can say about combat is there is a lot to like here, with a lot of potential left on the table for something a little bit more. There's a lot of cool combinations you can set up with each of the abilities. The gauntlet allows for more of control of the area, being able to zap around the arena and pull enemies towards you, and you can get an upgrade later on which allows you to pull like 3 enemies at once and do more damage whenever you are doing your different punches. You are also able to juggle enemies, which allows you to do different attacks, and also cannonball them into enemies or larger enemies to do more damage. But what this game struggles with in the later parts is where the enemy variety doesn't really change too much, and a lot of the big boss monsters that you run into tend to be kind of sponges that you whack away on. Shooting does feel really nice, and I enjoy the responsiveness, especially fanning the hammer, and it's one of the better aspects of the game, purely because there are these weak points on monsters that when they activate them, you can do big damage. And I think a lot more time spent with making specific weak points on enemies would have been a hell of a lot better for the shooting aspect, and maybe even for melee combat as well. I did enjoy a little bit, but as I say, a bit spongy at times. And even on the middle difficulty, it was a bit spongy too. But I think the best thing about the combat is the big specific story boss fights. Minor spoilers in the gameplay here, but when you get to this point in the story, the bosses actually have mechanics and things to learn and avoid rather than just a string of attacks that they would do. So for example, you would fight this big worm that would have 2 tentacles. There would be a weak point, and if you shot the weak point at the right time, you would then be able to do some extra damage. Once you defeat either one of the tentacles or both of them, you'll be able to damage the boss fully, and then they would do like a damaging effect where they drop rocks on you, and that was a really cool effect. You also get to fight some other bosses later on that have different mechanics that you have to avoid, and I like that. I like that element. They would increase their attacks, and they would also increase the pace at which they were attacking you. My problem with the combat comes from a visual standpoint though, and visually the attacks and abilities do look cool and awesome, but the animations are very limited when it comes to this game. For example, you keep seeing the same animation of a finishing animation on enemies, and it just doesn't give you that same satisfaction when you fight some of the huge monsters. and you do a couple of these animations and they're just very basic, especially in the current market of animations. It just wasn't as cool as I wanted it to be, and I wanted to have a little bit more. Another issue I kind of had was as you get into the latter stages of the game, it just throws a bunch of the big boss monsters at you, not like the big boss specific ones that I've just talked about, just these big monsters. And whilst they're cool at first, when there's like 6 of them coming after you, it can be a little bit frustrating. With all that being said, the combat on the whole was pretty fun. I enjoyed the gunplay and how the combat feels when you have a lot of the tools unlocked and you progressively get better. And maybe if I played this on co-op or New Game Plus, I would have a lot more fun with all of the abilities and it would probably change my view of combat, but this is the point that I have arrived on. I'm very split in the design of Evil West. On the one side, I like the idea and the aesthetic of the combat mechanics, but the level design, whilst yes, smaller in budget, is much more linear than I expected. It's very much combat encounter, area navigation, and then into another combat encounter. There's nothing too crazy about it. I would have loved if this game did a little bit more in the moment-to-moment areas, and maybe with a bigger budget and maybe they had more time to be able to work on these, it would spruce up the interactions with the environment in that little downtime period, and maybe add a little bit more to the combat arenas than just kind of some spikes or TNT left around the arenas. But on the other side of the coin, I do think the sounds of the weapons and all of the monsters are pretty cool. The visual look of all the characters and enemies were pretty great, especially the big vampire highborns, which made you feel like you were fighting these big vampire lords. And it's got me thinking that maybe a majority of the budget was spent on the cutscenes and the combat gameplay, and they maybe didn't have much as left to work on the other areas of the games due to constraints. But I can definitely see this team take it up a level when they make a sequel, potentially, if this game gets enough sales to be able to do it, at least in the design department. As I like to do when I'm writing reviews, I kind of have the themes and the feelings I have coming away from the game. Evil West has a great concept for a game, but to answer the question, is it worth it or should I play this? I can't recommend Evil West. This is because Evil West doesn't do anything awful or exceptional. It hits some highs and lows throughout the game. I found charm in the story where some might not. I had fun with the combat where some might not. And I really wanted to like this game more than what it is. I feel like it could have had a whole lot more, and maybe on a bigger budget, it could have been a whole lot more. If you are planning on playing this game when it releases tomorrow, please let me know. I've obviously brought out an early review, so I won't be able to get your thoughts fully yet. But if you're watching this after a couple of days, please make sure you tell me your thoughts on the game. If you enjoyed this review, let me know. And if you did, hit the like button and subscribe for more content. And this has been It's Jimbo, and I'll see you guys next time.